Good to see you, Sophia. How's Beijing?
Well, Beijing is great. My background is that what reminds you? I took my kids to the Forbidden City, and it's always nice. And I like this angle in particular. It's outside. It's outside
Yeah,
the Forbidden City, but I just like that angle because
yeah.
it looks like outside and inside the wall. You see something there, kind of mysterious. And then the river is to protect the Forbidden City.
Mm,
So the whole thing is kind of
yes.
interesting. Um,
The Gugong, isn't it? The old palace, isn't that
yes,
what most
Google,
people
yes.
call it?
Yeah,
Yes,
the old
the
palace, yes.
Gugong. Yeah.
And I also took my kids to Hunan province, where Mao Zedong is from. I actually visited his hometown, his houses and all
Mm,
that.
mm,
The tour guide told us that there are more people now interested in visiting that place because they want to learn more about
mm.
him. I just want to check with you. I know that in the West, they portray him, Mao, as this horrible dictator, which is very different from how he's perceived in China. People, the more, China developed, the more people are saying, China wouldn't be today's China without him, which is true. Now, he's not
Yeah.
perfect like anybody, nobody's perfect.
Mm.
He made mistakes, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, those were mistakes. I don't want to, minimize those mistakes, but it is true that China's today wouldn't be China's today without him. What is your view
Mm.
on him? I'm just a little bit curious.
Absolutely. I remember him very well, of course. He died in 1976, so
Hmm.
I was 15. I thought he was an absolutely titanic figure,
Hmm.
and I think that he saved China.
Yeah.
And when I say saved China, I mean, if you look at what China went through, he was an absolutely heroic figure in resisting the Japanese.
Yes.
I think that is something that, again, in the West, people simply don't appreciate. But
Mhm.
the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, which he led, were the core to the resistance against the Japanese. Because, I mean, Chiang Kai shek was just so corrupt and so much under the control of the British, basically, that, I mean, he just wasn't resisting the Japanese. And he was much more interested, in fact, in fighting the Communist Party and the
Mhm.
People's
Mhm.
Liberation Army than he was in fighting the Japanese. So he played an absolutely fundamental role in all of this.
Yeah.
Then he brought unity and stability to China and to its people, such as they simply had not had for 100 and more years, and he gave them their pride back. So, I
Mhm.
mean, he created the governmental system that exists to this day in China. I mean, the whole structure. He gave the unity to the country. But this is a thing that perhaps people don't remember as well in China itself. I mean, the sheer sense of pride finally the Chinese people had again in China, the sense that China was once again coming together, becoming a country
Mhm.
and becoming a strong country again. And he also played an absolutely critical role, a crucial role in the whole process of decolonization around the world, which simply cannot be underestimated. I mean, I remember he was a titanic figure. And I remember when the Americans met him in the early 70s. And by then, he was an old man and clearly past his prime, but they were in absolute awe of him. One
Mhm.
of the earliest memories I have, by the way, of politics was going to a cinema in Athens in the 60s. Must have been 1966, and seeing film of him, in that extraordinary swim on the
Mhm.
Yangtze River, which, or was it the Yellow River? I can't remember what it was, but it was
Young, yeah,
which,
young the river.
um,
Yeah.
again, people in the West don't talk about anymore. But I mean, it was one of the great iconic events of the 1960s. And
Mhm.
yes, obviously, the Cultural Revolution went completely out of control.
Mhm.
The Great Leap Forward, I personally suspect that when we get to unscramble all the stories, we will find that actually more progress was achieved during that period than, I
Probably.
mean, I'm in terrible suffering as well. But again, um, what people tend to overlook once more is that the period from 1950 to 57 was a period of very, very rapid economic and industrial growth in China. Growth was running at about 7% per annum. So, I mean, people were immediately seeing a major change in their lives. And then again, after the Great Leap Forward, and after the Cultural Revolution, growth resumed. So, I mean, he was, as I said, an epochal figure. No, I absolutely take that view. I can completely understand why the Chinese people think so highly of him, and I would, frankly, if I was Chinese.
Yeah.
Can I just say something? I mean, if you go to Russia today, there is a massive reassessment underway in Russia of Joseph Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a very, very widespread view today in Russia that, he was actually, again, for all his faults, ultimately a titanic leader who again led Russia, the Soviet Union, through victory in the Second World War against the Germans, and who achieved the industrialization of the country, and who again saved Russia from complete annihilation. So I mean, there is a swing back to Stalin as well, and I don't know whether you know, but the city that used to be Stalingrad and then became Volgograd apparently wants to go back and start calling itself Stalingrad again. And you may also be interested to know that in Russia, and I saw it while I was there actually in St. Petersburg, there was a formerly famous poster of Stalin and Mao together.
Oh, okay.
Because Mao
Yeah.
came
Uh-huh.
to the Soviet Union and met Stalin in, I think it was 1949. But anyway, there's a picture of the two of them together. It's not a photograph. It's a poster.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
So,
Well,
so
in Hunan province, in particular, I think he's almost like Mao is almost like a godlike figure. And what's interesting to me, the tour guide actually told us that when you visit his birthplace, there's a statue and all that sort of thing. He said actually you're not allowed to kneel down. You're allowed to bow down and then bring flowers. They don't want to godify him. He is human. He made mistakes. So they actually recognize that. So I actually think that's a good thing. That's a sensible thing. Don't make him like a
absolutely, no, of
figure.
course it is.
Yeah. So I think that's
Absolutely, which is right, and it's not the Chinese thing anyway. Actually, I mean, it's never been. The Chinese people have never been into declaring their leaders gods. We do that
yeah.
in the West, not in China. The ancient Greeks did it too, by the way. They made their leaders divine, as did the emperors,
Yeah.
the Roman emperors. So.
And the other thing is just over the weekend, I don't know if you pay attention to the Dragon Boat Festival, which is, yeah, Dragon Boat Festival is interesting. I think you can probably share it with your wife, Catherine. She might find it interesting because Dragon Boat Festival is celebrating a person called Qu Yuan. He's most famous being a poet, but he's also a statesman. He's very important during the warrior period. His country at the time is the one of those seven countries that was fighting the Qin dynasty, the Qin, and then Qin, of course, his country is Chu, and Chu was defeated. So he killed himself. He jumped into the river and then killed himself for that. And then the people was very sad that he was a good statesman, a prime minister kind of person.
Right.
So they wrapped the 粽子, but basically put food into wrappers and throw into the river so that the fish will eat those food instead of eating him. So that's what the Dragon Boat Festival, the Dragon Boat Festival come from. So it's a festival in memory of this person, even though he was a great statesman, but mainly people remember him as a great poet, a great writer, that kind of personality. You might find that interesting.
Yeah. That's very interesting. It's very Chinese again. I mean, the China has these extraordinary cultural figures who are so important to the Chinese people. There's no analog to this in the West, by the way. I mean, there is no. If anything, the one that is closest is Pushkin to the Russians.
Okay.
But China has many, many more people like that. Yeah. But China has many, many more people like that. That these tremendous cultural personalities that are seen as not just statesmen, but as builders
Uh-huh.
of
Yeah.
Chinese civilization,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is something that Chinese people take so seriously, and
Yeah.
are rightly so, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, let's start with the South Korea election, right? Which just happened. So Lee Jae-ming, he won. He's regarded as pro-China. I'm not sure that's the reason he was elected. What is your take?
Well, I think in a kind of a way it probably is actually. South Korea is a regime that was associated with the previous leader, the one who's gone, who carried
Uh-huh.
out the attempted coup
Uh-huh.
and all that, which was very, very pro-American, created massive problems with the North Korea,
Mhm.
which was straightforwardly anti-Chinese as well, in the sense that he was aligning South Korea with the United States and Japan in an alliance against China,
Mhm.
because ultimately, as I said, everything comes down to China,
Mhm.
and who was also supplying shells and weapons to Ukraine to
Yeah.
fight Russia,
Mhm.
something which upset the Russians, who had
Mhm.
up to that time fairly good relations with South Korea. So I think this does represent a major sea change. So I think I went to South Korea in the early 2000s. I think it was 2002. And I was struck how even then the influence of China was very strong. I mean, the cultural influence of China, it was everywhere. So I cannot even begin to imagine how it is today. It must be something that is absolutely pervasive in South Korea. So what we had was an attempt to pull South Korea away from its natural course and alignment. And I think this election reflects this. And the deeper political crisis we have seen in South Korea probably reflects it as well, in that we had an attempt by a pro-American government to prize South Korea away from its natural alignments.
Now, in the meantime, also in Asia, the Shangri-La dialogue, which had a lot of got lots of attention in China. Now, China didn't send its foreign minister this time. Normally, it would, but this time China didn't. China has been unhappy about the Shangri-La dialogue for a while because this is supposed to be a forum for Asian countries to talk about defense, to communicate. But of course, every time the United States will come, and this time
Yeah.
Macron even went there and give this speech and threatening China, saying if you don't control North Korea, NATO will come and stuff like that. What is your take on that? People are not very happy
Well,
about the speech.
well, I can imagine. I mean, is this the same Macron who met with Xi Jinping? Was it a year ago, or just before that, and was coming back to Europe and saying what a wonderful thing it would be to have a good relationship with China, and who received Xi Jinping with massive honors and in Paris, and brought out the horse guards for him, which I could see the Chinese weren't impressed by at all, by the way. But anyway, that was it. So this is Macron, and he swings around like a weather vane. But ultimately, now he's completely given up his heart and soul to the Americans, or a faction within the US. The Americans, as you rightly say, have basically gate crashed this dialogue. Macron has invited himself, so he gate crashed it too. We've had incredibly belligerent speeches now, not just from Macron,
Mhm.
but from Pete Hegseth.
Mhm.
So I think, from every conceivable point of view, it makes absolute sense for the Chinese to stay away. Why would they go to be lectured?
And also, meantime, not just the verbal, like heated verbal exchange, not exchange, but verbal threat or something. But also, there has been a military exercise the U.S. conduct shortly before the Shangri-La dialogue, which in China being interpreted as a threat, like before we say something, let's do some exercise. And the U.S. did that with the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. And even the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier was supposed to head to Middle East, but then turned back I guess, to participate in this military exercise in the South China Sea. And in the midst of all that, I think last weekend there was a rumor. I don't see report in the West, but there is a rumor circling, heavily circling in China, that China shot down a F-35. So the whole thing
Oh,
is kind of, yeah,
no,
the whole
no,
thing
it
is
has
kind of,
not been reported in the
no,
West.
at all. So
Mm,
here's what
mm.
happened. The Chinese government social media account posted like a 10 seconds recording of a pilot reporting to the central command saying object disappeared from radar, should have been eliminated. Something like that, a very short sentence, like
Well,
a 10 seconds. And then without any explanation, but this is a very reputable government official account. So people started trying to interpret what it means. Now, the most people believe that means one F-35, which is stealth jet plane, was shut down. Okay, so that's the speculation. The interesting thing about that is with so much speculation, the Chinese government never came out saying, no, 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 that's not true. So which is being interpreted as probably that's what happened. What I'm trying to say is that it seems like the situation probably is more tense, more, more than what we see on the surface. It's not just a verbal attack. What do you think?
absolutely, absolutely. Can I just say quickly about this? I mean, it has not been reported in the West
Mm-hmm.
for very, very obvious reasons, especially if it was an F-35. That would be very, very, very alarming because we've been told repeatedly that these are, invisible and
Mm-hmm.
the best fighter jets in the world. They're not, by the way. But anyway, that's the story. But I do know an awful lot about incidents like this during the Cold War, and it turns out that there were many, many attempts by the Americans throughout the Cold War to intrude into Soviet airspace. And
Uh-huh.
quite a lot of American fighter jets and aircraft were shot down by the Soviets during the Cold War. And these incidents were never reported
Mm-hmm.
because both sides wanted to avoid a pattern of escalation arising out of them. But certainly this happened several times, and it would not at all surprise me if it happened again. I mean, I'm not sure where this incident took place, but clearly it was close to Chinese
Mm-hmm.
territory. And by territory, one includes, of course, seas adjoining China. So it's entirely, it would not surprise me in any way at all if something like this were to happen. And of course, if it was happening, the Americans were intruding again into Chinese territory and behaving in an incredibly aggressive way, like they always do, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And what exactly they're doing, testing China, trying to work out what the strength of what China's defenses are. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they do this, and as I said, it's very, very dangerous.
I feel like the United States probably is frustrated right now because uh, my understanding is that Pete Hegseth went to Shangri-La expecting to meet the Chinese defense minister, Dong Jun.
Yeah.
But after he left the United States, that's when the Chinese announced that Dong Jun is not coming. Instead, they sent a university, a military university, to study, to observe the meeting rather than actively participating. And so he was very frustrated, I
Yes.
guess. And then also, I guess there's a lot of other things we can talk later about trade that frustrating the U.S. So the U.S. goes with what it can, which is trying to show the muscle, kind of bullying through all kinds of means, verbally and exercise militarily. Is that what shows the U.S.
Yeah.
frustration?
Yes, it is, and it's a repeat of what happened during the Biden era. If you remember, there was a
Uh,
whole period of lasted about a year when China was not meeting U.S. officials, and the Americans began to become increasingly worried and anxious and angry about this. And eventually, I think it was Jake Sullivan managed to sort of go to China and
mm,
eventually broke the ice. But I think it's the same. I think that China has basically had enough,
mm,
and as they've had tariff wars, they've had threats. They're having more threats now, by the way, on the trade issue, which we will come to, as you said.
mm,
And I think that the Chinese are saying, look, this is hopeless. There's no sense in meeting and sitting down and talking with these people when they are being so incredibly aggressive and rude to us. If we sit down and talk to them when they're in this kind of mood, we're going back to the thing where they talk to us when they want to and are rude to us when they also want to. They lecture us and they don't listen, and they do the opposite of what they say. So there's no point in conducting a dialogue when the Americans are in this kind of mood. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah. Now, regarding the trade war, first of all, the U.S. court actually blocked most of Trump's tariffs. But my understanding is that because Trump is appealing, and then the appeals court granted stay, which means those tariffs are still in place, even though the court blocks most of it. Now, why doesn't Trump just use executive order? Why doesn't he work with the Congress to put in place some kind of a law? Since now the Republican control both the House and the Senate, why is he so reluctant to work with the Republicans?
It is an excellent question. I mean, he probably realizes that in the Senate, especially, not every Republican senator really likes it. So I think that's probably partly what it's all about. Also, I think Trump is somebody who likes to give the impression of being, the supreme ruler who is in complete control and who can do whatever he likes. And I think that is part of his own self-image, and it's part of the image that he wants to convey to the American people. So I think there's these two sides of it. I mean, I don't think he takes Congress especially seriously, and I don't think he particularly wants to have to cut deals with people in Congress on things like tariffs. And I think that's the reason, actually. I mean, there are other possible reasons that if he puts a tariff law before Congress, the way Congress works is that individual congressmen then attach their own amendments to it. And the thing starts to shift and morph and change. And probably Trump doesn't really want that. And he doesn't want to lose the flexibility of doing everything through executive orders. But by the way, I should say straight away that as far as I'm concerned, this is completely illegal. I happen to think on this issue, the original judge was right. And I think that for Trump to simply use some kind of law from long ago to say that this is a state of economic emergency and to change the entire economic and tax policies of the United States in this way is quite wrong. I'll be very interested to see what the Supreme Court eventually says about it.
Yeah. Now, about the U.S.-China trade war, it doesn't seem to go very well with the negotiation, right? After this pause that they agreed in Switzerland, so Trump suspended the sales of the civilian jet engines and suspended the sales of more semiconductors and other technologies to China, and also revoked the Chinese students' visa. I don't think it's fully implemented yet, but at least they're intended to do that, and accused China of violating the trade truce terms. That's according to Trump. But of course, China rejected that, saying we haven't, violated any terms. You're the aggressor. What is your take on all this going on?
Of course it is, and I mean, we're having again a big build up towards another big moment when the United States is going to start going back to imposing tariffs again, and we'll probably come to them later in the program. But Lindsey Graham is talking about sanctions, bone-crushing sanctions against Russia, but they're really tariffs against China. I mean, this is what is so bizarre about this. And he gave an interview yesterday. He's currently in Europe, by the way, in which he practically admitted as much, that this is really targeting China again. So I think that the US was brought back to economic reality when they did impose big tariffs against China. I mean, we had Walmart and all those people coming to Trump telling them, my God, you can't continue with this. If you do, we're going to start running out of goods in our shops and things of that kind. And I think for a brief moment with Scott Bessent and with the Treasury Secretary saying to Trump, look, this isn't sustainable, and with issues in the bond markets and all of that, the Americans came to their senses. But the problem with the Americans is, when things stabilize, the China haters, to call them by what they really are, always swing back into action. They're probably telling Trump, privately. You should never have made those concessions. We had the Chinese where we wanted them. 9 million jobs in China are at risk. Factories are closing. China was about to collapse. Gordon Chang is telling us this. So, let's go back and start doing this all over again, because then we'll get the Chinese where we want them. And you've got to show strength. And if you're as strong as you pretend, then you've got to start being tough with the Chinese. And so we've had the refusal to export aircraft engines. An absolutely crazy idea, by the way, can I just say, because aerospace, I used to do aerospace law amongst my other various things. So I take a great interest in it. And China is now forging fast ahead, developing its own aerospace industry. China is, as you know, building. It's got its advanced program for building wide-bodied jet airliners, and it is working very hard and successfully to build big high bypass turbofan engines, exactly the kind of engines that we are talking about. By the way, the Russians are also working very hard to build big high bypass turbofan engines, and they have done so in the past. So, they've already got on top of this technology. But the point is this: you would have thought that the very last thing that the United States would want to do is to stimulate China's civil aviation industry even more, given how important civil aviation historically has been since the end of the Second World War in propelling America's economic growth. I mean, it's one of its few big industrial exports have been civil aircraft and the engines and technology that go with that. Now, if China gets on top of this technology, which it will, within the next 5 years, we'll be starting to see big Chinese aircraft, much more modern than the products that Boeing produces. Big Chinese aircraft with efficient high bypass turbofan engines appearing. Then they will wipe the board. I mean, the United States will lose this massive Chinese market, which is hugely important for Boeing and all of them. And it will also start to lose market shares, especially in Asia. It is going to happen as night follows day. And of course, it's already lost Russia, because they did the same there. And the Russians, as I said, have been stimulating to develop their own civil aviation industry. So this was a particularly stupid thing to do, actually. I mean, it's worse in some respects for the US than what they did with chips, because America doesn't produce high-end chips. So China produces high-end chips. It's not directly competing with the US. But in civil aviation, it absolutely will be. And anybody who's deluded enough to think that the Chinese aren't going to be capable of building aircraft that are not just as good, but better than the current American products is fooling themselves.
Well, there's a lot of discussions in China about why China hasn't been very actively negotiating with the US. So I find some of them do have make a lot of sense. So for the two sides to negotiate, have a meaningful negotiation, both sides need to have something the other side wants and willing to give, right? So what does the US want from China? US want from China now rare earth, which China is controlling very tightly right now. And of course, want China to buy more treasury bonds, which China is more and more reluctant to do. I mean, you just talk about the bond market, right? So the bond market is not just China, but in general, the confidence is going down. So China is reluctant to buy more treasury bonds. In fact, I think they have been dumping some. And then ultimately, the US doesn't want to see China continue to develop, which is not going to happen. China will continue. So you see all these things that US want from China, it's not going to get it. And what does China want from the US? Well, ultimately, China interested in the US market, which is a very attractive, lucrative market, but getting less so, because when China gets the US market, it makes money, it makes dollar. And then the dollar they use, they want to buy things from the US. A lot of things US doesn't sell. The latest is the civil, aviation engine. And so the things that, you have, China has the dollar, but they can't buy things that US can sell, but will not sell. And also want China to buy more treasury bonds with China less interested. So the US doesn't really have a whole lot that China wants or that China wants that US can give, right? So you see the problem that both sides now is stuck in a
Yeah.
situation that I have things that you need, but I'm not giving to you, and you have things that I need, but you're not giving to me. Then how do you negotiate, right?
You've explained things much more clearly than anyone has done, and I've just learned an awful lot about things from that because I hadn't appreciated it in that quite that way actually. But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, what the United States wants is its usual thing. It wants to be as rude and as aggressive against China as possible. And at the same time, it wants the Chinese to go ahead and continue to buy treasury bonds because ultimately that's what the United States wants China to do. And it wants to get the Chinese essentially to send money into the United States and to stop at the same time competing with the United States. It wants to have its cake and eat it as well. Um, you cannot possibly build an economic relationship in that kind of way, certainly not a trading relationship in that kind of way. And the Americans are greatly exaggerating today the importance of their domestic market.
Mm-hmm.
They've convinced themselves that because they're the biggest market in the world, and they're a very big market, they've convinced themselves that because they're, as they imagine, the biggest market in the world, everybody is queuing up to sell them things and will make massive concessions to America to continue to do that. The biggest market in the world, I suspect, is already China, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to get much bigger. It's inevitable. I mean, Chinese people have these enormous savings.
Yeah.
They produce the best manufactured goods in the world. It is only logical that they will buy more of them. I mean, it's inevitably going to happen. And as I pointed out to someone, well, right, China may have had some factories closed, and some people may have lost their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and it could be as many as 9 million. But
Mm-hmm.
that's 9 million out of what is it, 1.4 billion people? I mean, it's not, it may seem a lot
Mm-hmm.
in America, but in an economy with the scale of China's and its adaptability is going to be able to adjust to this very, very quickly. And going back to our early discussions about Mao, I mean, given what China has been through, anybody who thinks that they can't deal with a problem like this is deluding themselves again. I mean, this is a country that has had to overcome challenges that are infinitely greater. This
Yeah.
isn't like the Japanese invasion or the crisis of the 1960s when China was facing pressures from both America and Russia at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. I mean, it isn't like that. So I mean, it's something that people in the US just can't get their heads around. But I mean, it's a fact.
And I think also there's a misunderstanding in the US when Trump is saying he saved millions of Chinese jobs when he put a pause on the tariffs. Well, China actually doesn't see these problems the way that the West does. So let's say China lost 9 million jobs because of the trade war with the US. Well, China see that as a larger problem, which is where is the next job creators? So what is the next, like a technology development, how to expand with other countries. Of course, there's a globe here. So China see it like a big problem. Where are the jobs created? And yes, with the US, yes, there is some problem there, some jobs, but that's also belong to a bigger problem is where should we create jobs next, right? So it's not like, okay, because this 9 million jobs, we have to cave into the US to save that 9 million jobs. That's not how China's
No,
thinking or planning is. I think that's something that I don't think the US government understand. Trump doesn't,
no.
I don't think.
No, they don't. I mean, they've got this idea which is promoted not just by Gordon Chan, but by all
Hmm.
kinds of quack economists, if I can call them that China is this sweatshop economy where people work for, slave labor wages
Hmm.
in order to sell to the enormously rich United States. And this is a completely false understanding of China. I've only been to China once in 2017, by
Hmm.
the way, and that was years ago now. But I mean, it was immediately obvious to me then that that entire narrative was absolutely phony.
Hmm.
And one of the things that gave it away instantly was looking at all of the Western brands. I was in Shanghai that
Hmm.
had set up their shops in China, and I mean, obviously, they were there were Chinese people then who had enough money, more than enough money, to buy from these shops. The West has a completely false understanding of China. They don't understand what China is like.
Hmm.
They imagine that it's still at the level it was in the 1950s, and I don't realize it's not like that at all. But that's what happens if you listen to someone like Gordon Chang
Hmm.
every day. Sorry to harp on about him. It's just that he's all over the place at the moment.
Yeah, I noticed that they have a much broader discussion. Like AI is also replacing a lot of jobs, right? What do you do with the things like
Yeah,
that? Of course, they invested a lot on tourism, on services, and also giving encouragement for starting your own company. And of course, education itself, just so that you can get a better understanding of where technology is and stuff like that. There are massive amount of effort put into that to where job growth, in the future
absolutely.
which is not limited just to the trade. It's actually not that much obsession with the trade itself, actually. That's how I feel.
No. China has the world's biggest savings. It
Uh-huh.
has the world's biggest manufacturing. It is now, as even people in the West are starting to understand, an incredibly, exceptionally large technology and science base, which is now at the cutting edge.
Hmm.
Um, it is not and it has, because it's got these huge savings, a very, very sound financial position overall.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not in trouble. I mean, this is a thing that people don't understand. In fact, what Trump and the Americans are doing, I could say this as night follows day. It's going
Hmm.
to kickstart the next stage of Chinese development and going to make it even more rapid.
Yeah.
I gave you the example of aircraft. I mean, we will see, as I said, in a couple of years, um, Chinese civil aircraft appearing, and they will be built in China, not in Toulouse with Airbus or in Seattle by Boeing. That's the reality of it. I mean, the Chinese ones are going to be better, just like Chinese electric vehicles are so much better than everybody else's, because the Chinese are coming to this technology fresh and
Hmm.
new, and they understand. They will look at these things with a much clearer eye, and they won't be stuck in old industrial methods and industrial designs. So we will have better Chinese engines, cleaner engines,
Hmm.
better aircraft. By the way, just to quickly say this, um, again, I said that I did aerospace things. According to what many people think, the Ilyushin 96, which is the Russian
Hmm.
aircraft, is actually, in some respects, better than the American Boeing ones for precisely that reason. Even though it is based on the technologies of the 1980s, it has a more advanced and modern
Hmm.
philosophy of the way it's laid out and the gravity and all of that than the American aircraft do, which have their roots in the technology of the 1960s when the Americans first started building wide-bodied aircraft. The Chinese are going to build aircrafts now with the technology of today,
Hmm.
so you could see what's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, about the Russian Ukraine.
Mm,
This drone truck attack, that deep
yeah.
inside Russia, it got lots of attention, as you can imagine. What is your take on that? It is a clever attack, but does it change anything?
It changes absolutely nothing. It was more again an exercise in public relations. Apparently, they managed to destroy three bombers, and we're talking about bombers
Mhm.
that were designed in Joseph Stalin's time. I mean, we're talking about the first Tupolev 95 flew in 1952. So they are mighty and splendid aircraft. I mean, if you look at them, I've seen them, and
Mhm.
you see them fly. They are extraordinary machines, and they still have the world's most powerful turbofan engine, and they make an incredible noise. You can hear them for miles. I mean, it's which already, of course, makes them rather inefficient as bombers. Just to say, I mean, they're certainly not stealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, they are magnificent machines, but they are completely antiquated. So the Russians, anyway, are busy building more advanced bombers. They seem to have gone more down the supersonic route than the stealth route. So supposedly they have a
Mhm.
stealth bomber being developed. But anyway, whatever. So three of these bombers, of which the Russians have supposedly around 60, and they have been destroyed. A couple of others have been damaged. It's not going to do anything in terms of Russia's military capabilities. It's not going to affect the balance of power between Russia and the United States. It was, as you said, a very clever operation, but it is one that will have compromised agent networks that Ukraine has established inside Russia because you needed to do this. You inevitably are going to compromise your networks in order to do this, and it's not going to change the course of the war, and it's not going to change the strategic balance. It is very much part of what Ukraine does nowadays, which is that it tries to divert attention away from military defeats on the battlefronts by engaging in these public relations exercises, which is what this all ultimately was. Attacks on the railway bridge, the
Mhm.
bridge between Russia and Crimea, is another example.
Mhm.
Um, None of these things ultimately change the overall picture, and they don't change the Russian approach to the war or Russia's diplomatic strategy.
But these attacks, it also reminds me a little bit like the pager attack, that Israel did.
Yeah,
I think these
yeah.
these attacks they blurry the lines between war zone and the home front. Also, blurry the lines between war and terror attacks, isn't it? So that in that sense, it's kind of
Oh,
scary
yeah.
in a way, don't you think?
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, can I just say something? I mean, you're completely right because I mean, you're using civilian trucks and vehicles
Hmm.
to conduct attacks. Apparently, some of the drivers of these trucks weren't aware of what it was that they were carrying, which is already, and one of them was murdered, it seems,
Hmm.
which I mean does elevate the the thing to some extent into a terror attack. But it may surprise people in China to know that the attack that gained an awful lot more attention in Russia was two attacks that the Ukrainians carried out against the Russian railway system. And they blew up
Hmm.
two bridges. And they blew up one bridge as a civilian train was crossing, and several, I mean, and that was a civilian train with
Hmm.
civilians in it, and some people were killed and other people were injured, and the Russians are treating that as a terrorist attack, which
Hmm.
it was.
Yeah.
If you do this kind of thing, this kind of sabotage operations, I mean, you always run the risk of drifting into terrorist attacks. And this some of these are now becoming straightforward terrorist attacks. And the West says nothing. It
Yeah.
just sits back. I was reading a long article about this in the media, in the Russian media, a long article about how the Ukrainians are able to carry out assassinations and murders and blow up trains and
Hmm.
kill civilians inside Russia. And no one ever says
Hmm.
anything about it in the West. There's never any criticism, there's never any comment about how it was wrong or anything of that sort.
They were also trying to assassinate Putin, right? He was flying, and then they sent a massive
Yeah,
drones trying to
yeah,
attack his
yeah.
plane, right? But they need to understand if they if they were successful, that would be the end of Ukraine. Do they understand that?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that,
No, I don't think. I don't think they do. I think one of the fundamental problems with the Ukrainians is that they are addicted to this kind of thing, and once you become addicted to it, it becomes compulsive. I think, and I'm going to say this, I think they learned it from the British, by the way, who are also addicted to this kind of thing. They have been ever since the Second World War. They think that, asymmetric war, killing Russian leaders, killing Russian generals. The Russians believe, and I'm sure they're right, by the way, that it was the Ukrainians who were behind the attack on the rock concert that took place last year, this time last year. So
yeah.
all of this is straightforward terrorism, and of course the Russians, as they always do, they're very, very methodical. They're making careful records of all of this, and one day they will come after all of these people.
Yeah.
Of that, I have absolutely no doubt.
I don't think they understand the problem is not Putin, right? If Putin, let's say, stepped down today, a new president, maybe even more aggressive, I don't think they understand that.
Oh, a new president would be a lot more aggressive. I mean, I remember I was in Russia just 2 weeks ago, and I can absolutely say that if there is criticism of the Russian government at all, even from lawyers, and I attended a conference of lawyers, civilians, if there is criticism of the Russian government at all, it is that it is not being tough enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was talking to some people here, taxi drivers, if there are any criticism to the Chinese government is why they haven't taken back Taiwan already, militarily.
Yeah.
There is very
Yeah.
few people talking about peaceful reunification. I
No.
think Xi Jinping probably belong to the minorities here.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, you see, these are the leaders.
Yeah.
Leaders have to be more careful and prudent. I mean, it's a point that I'm always, I always getting people coming along and telling me, why is Putin so soft? Why doesn't he react? I haven't had it with Xi Jinping because obviously I don't cover China so much. But I mean, thank God they are.
Yeah.
Thank God these leaders are as careful and as serious and as disciplined in their approach to things as they are. Just imagine if they were all like Biden or Trump. I mean, where would we be? Probably dead by now.
Well, the other thing is Europeans, they are now lifting Russians' restrictions on long-range weapons. And Germany is building up its military. UK is now boosting its military spending. No wonder there's talking online, hashtag World War III right now. I mean, like you said, thank God that Putin is a person that have self-control, right? Isn't it? I mean, Europeans are the ones who are escalating. They don't seem to care much, right?
Yes. No, I mean, it's becoming the organizing principle in European politics. You don't have much else. I mean, our economies are all in bad ways, some more so than others, but Germany's economy is in very bad shape, and I know Germany quite well. Britain's economy, which of course I know very well, is in very, very bad shape. Governments are unpopular. They're feeling that their support amongst the populations that they govern is slipping. So how do they hold everything together? They talk about the threat from the east. They talk about, Moscow's long arm that is going to come and take over Edinburgh, I suppose, or Sheffield. I'm not quite sure why the Russians would want to go there. But anyway, there's this endless narrative being put together. And of course, you can use it to attack any political leader who is in some ways a dissident political leader, because you say you're being soft on Russia, you're a Russian apologist, a Putin apologist. They say the same about people who are sympathetic to China. I mean, so it's becoming increasingly, and this is a very dangerous thing, by the way. It's becoming the organizing principle of our politics, and it's more important, in my opinion, than whether the actual rearmament even happens. The British government has released a 35,000 word strategic defense review. 35,000 is not that long, by the way.
Hmm.
I've read it. It's unbelievably vague. It's completely lacking in any real concrete substance. I mean, if you are looking for an actual plan
Hmm.
of how to build up an industrial base, how to build weapons, what kind of weapons you need. There's nothing like that. I mean, Chinese people who would read this would be baffled, I think. This is a defense paper. But what it does do, of course, is amplify all the rhetoric about the threat from Russia. And that's its purpose.
Yeah, and one thing that the Chinese media interpreted Macron's speech at the Shangri-La dialogue is because he encountered so much trouble domestically, right? And of course, he's losing control over African colonies, former colonies.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of like doesn't know what to do. And then one thing he could do is threatening Asia. Oh, NATO is coming if China, doesn't do this and that, which actually I think what the Asian countries see is, okay, you guys from the West, you like wars and conflict. You're now talking about bring them to Asia, right? To destabilize Asia. It's not enough you have wars in Europe, you want to destabilize Asia. And that's how it was perceived, by Macron's speech was perceived. I think not just in China, but also in ASEAN countries as well. So
I have absolutely no doubt about this at all. I mean, I think people in Asia are looking at all of this with horror. They're saying, the French are coming along and they're going to start organizing military things here. I mean, they made such a complete mess of relations, of the situation in Europe. And they want to export all their pathologies and their obsessions and their anger and their hatred to us. We're trying to build our societies and build our industries and increase the wealth and prosperity and well-being of our people. I think it's going to be very unwelcome in Asia altogether. I think Asian people are going to be absolutely bewildered by it. But there it is. I come back to what I said many times about the fundamental difference between Europeans and Asians. European states, including the Americans, who are a kind of European state, are obsessed with power. Power is what drives them, and it was military power more than anything else.
Regarding this India-Pakistan situation, what's interesting is the New York Times had an article. The title is How the India Media Amplifies a Falsehood in a Drumbeat of War. And it says, subtitle is, during a conflict between India and Pakistan, even some long trusted outlets reported unverified information and fabricated stories. And so it's not a very flattering piece of Modi and the Indian media. It is true the Indian media doesn't talk much about the fighter jets got shot down. They even celebrated as some kind of victory. It's true, which is puzzling to me. But not only that, India also sent out some delegations to different countries. Now they were supposedly to get support for anti-terrorist, zero tolerance for India's effort for zero tolerance of terrorists. But in reality, they seem to try to convince people that they won the war somehow. Now, what's your take on that? Why is it so important for Modi to make such a big deal and even falsify some information just mainly for the domestic audience? Political.
I mean, just before we start on that, I mean, the American media complaining about the fact that the Indian media provides false information about wars. I mean, really, I mean, what a surprise. I mean, surely the Americans would never do that themselves. I mean, it's inconceivable that they would ever provide that kind of false information or publish unverified inaccurate stories. The Americans really do amaze you sometimes. Anyway, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, the reality of this short conflict is that India came out of it deeply humiliated. I mean, it imagines itself in some ways, with some cause, to be an emerging great power. It's a big country. It's got a big economy. And the Indians, I think, have got far ahead of themselves in terms of their own perceptions. They believe that they're stronger, more advanced, better organized than they actually are. And so they came up against Pakistan. and their military didn't perform particularly well, as it's now increasingly clear. Some of their air defense units did better, but overall it was not the great success and victory that they imagined. And they are massively embarrassed. And that's the reason. I mean, they're trying to overcompensate by pretending that they won some great victory when, of course, they didn't. And they're trying to persuade everybody that they did win some great victory by going and round and sending delegations to talk people into thinking that. It's something that, if you follow the Indian media as closely as I do, there's a degree of shock and anger. And some of this anger is, by the way, directed at the Americans, who are seen as playing some kind of a role here in bringing about this humiliation. But a lot of it is eternally directed that India somehow failed this test, wasn't able to show that it was the really strong country that it wants to believe that it is, and has lost face.
You see, that's very different. India and China are very different handling this. In 2001, there was a fighter jet, the Chinese fighter jet, collided with a surveillance aircraft of the U.S., in the South China Sea. And before the pilot, now the pilot was killed in that incident. Before he was killed, there was a recording of him talking to the Central Command, and in that recording, he said, I won't be able to make it, something like that. Now that recording has been repeatedly played in the Chinese media, official media, social media, everywhere. See, China using those kind of opportunities to galvanize people, motivate people. China would never hide these kind of humiliations. Or, I mean, we were growing up, as I was growing up in China, we were told many, many times the centuries humiliation. You will never forget about that. You will never, not hearing all those humiliations. The British, what the British did, the Japanese did, those sort of things. Now, I think in this incident, the Indian should tell people, we still far away, far behind. We need to work harder, stuff like that. But that's not the Indian way, isn't it? It's very different, I think.
Yes, yes. No, it isn't, and that is a major problem, by the way. I've never been to India, I should say, but I do know a lot of. I have a lot of Indian friends, and I've always taken an interest in the problem, and it's a long, deep-seated problem, which is that India assumes that it should be a great country, but is much less ready to do the things to make itself a great country. I mean, it has the means to do them, but to give an example, it does not have an education system similar to the one which, let's go back to him, Mao Zedong created in China. I mean, there wasn't this systematic attempt in India. There's never been a systematic attempt in India that there was in China after 1949 to bring universal literacy to the country, to create strong universities, to develop a strong technological and industrial engineering class, to train managers who are good at managing big projects. That India doesn't tend to do this. And if you know anything about the Indian education system, at the very high end, it's still very influenced by the British. So you have these extremely expensive, highly privileged schools modeled on English public schools, which are the ones that the Indian elite send their children to. And they come out and they're very, very elegant, highly educated people, very proficient in some things, very good at becoming senior civil servants in the Indian government, it still has a civil service based very much on the British model. And in some ways, it's a very good civil service, but it's a civil service that is good at administering what is there. It's not good at managing. It's not good at creating, saying, we need to rebuild the entire railway system. We need to think about high-speed trains. We need to build an aircraft industry. We need to think about how to do all of those things. This isn't what the Indians do. I'll give another example, which is, again, one I know a little bit about, which is that they made a huge effort to build a pharmaceutical industry. And I remember Modi saying that India was the pharmacy of the world. This he was saying during COVID. What he didn't tell people is that, of course, these are all made by outside countries in India. And it's very much the lower end of medicines. I mean, they're not developed their own more advanced medicines or things of this kind. So India needs to shake out of this. It needs to be much more purposeful in the way that it conducts its it builds up its economy. And I'm afraid it's not doing that. And I think the fact that it's had a period of obscures many of the underlying problems, which are not going away, because when you look at what is driving that GDP growth, it's not actually developmental in the way that it was in China's case. I think the gap between China and India is growing, by the way, just to say.
Yeah. Okay. The Middle East, the Iranian officials, they said the U.S. nuclear proposal is incoherent and disjointed, and afraid like a momentum is collapsing. So, what do you think going on there?
No, I think this is exactly. I think you've described it exactly, and I think the Iranians have described it exactly. I mean, things are just falling apart, even though this is a deal that was there on the table. The Iranians do not want nuclear weapons. The Americans say they do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Iran has now good relations with Saudi Arabia. It's a member of BRICS. Its priority is to build up its economy and its society. So a deal ought to be there on the table. But if you go back to the US, you see all the usual people, their rhetoric is that we want war with Iran. So people like Mark Levin, for example, with Iran. And though I don't think Trump himself really wants war with Iran, I think he senses that it would be an absolute disaster for the United States if it got drawn into another war for Iran. And even more important for Trump, a disaster if he's presidency, if he got drawn into a war with Iran. These people, and they've already pushed Trump into demanding that Iran basically stop all uranium enrichment entirely. In other words, that it give up all work on nuclear technology, which the Iranians absolutely correctly see as a gross violation of their sovereign rights as a nation to engage in economic and technological development, which they cannot agree to. So, I mean, we have a possible deal. It's not difficult to see how it could be agreed. And the opportunity is being thrown away because some people in America just cannot accept that a deal like that for the United States makes better sense. Have you ever listened to Mark Levin? I mean, I mention him because I gather he's perhaps the more visible person. But I mean, the way he talks about Iran is not just irrational, but you know what the Iranians said about it being incoherent. His hatred of Iran is expressed in ways that are practically incoherent. I mean, he talks in ways that, I mean, his language, I mean, I listen to him and I'm trying to say to myself, what exactly is this man even trying to say sometimes? Anyway, there it is.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes their hatred driven them lost control. You know, they lost sight of things, I think. Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
Greta Thunberg, we haven't heard from her for a while, right? About her. The West seems lost the interest in her. But she recently joined a ship sailing to Gaza with I think 11 other
Yeah.
people, including some actor. And okay, so their aim is to breaking the Israeli blockade and bring aid to Gaza. I think it's a good thing, but I also think it's kind of late.
Yeah.
She could have done this earlier. But in any event, so here is the Telegraph opinion
Yeah.
piece, or I can call it a hit piece. The title is Greta Thunberg's narcissism has escalated to terrifying levels. And so on the one hand, I personally think it's a good thing, but it's kind of late. But also,
No.
can we say the West kind of lost love to Greta Thunberg now?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, she's gone against the sacred issue, which is Israel and all
Mhm,
of this. So already now she's transgressed
mhm,
against the wishes of the Western establishment. Which, and I think this is a thing to say. I mean, they've made some criticisms of Israel because Israeli policies now have become so
mhm,
appallingly and publicly horrible.
yeah,
But deep down, there is every bit as pro-Israeli as they've
mhm,
always been. It's constructing alibis. These criticisms of Israel are not intended to really change policy in Israel. It's to give Western leaders some distance from what
mhm,
the Israelis are doing.
yeah. In other words, her
Hello?
effort probably won't make
Sorry.
much difference, right?
It won't make any difference at all. I mean,
Mhm,
I think it's true anyway that her star has been dimming for
mhm,
some time. And
mhm,
if I'm going to be a bit cynical, I suspect that part of the reason for this stunt is precisely the fact that she wants to draw attention to herself. I mean, she's
yeah,
been in the eye of, you know, the public, and it must be rather strange to find that people are losing interest in you.
yeah,
So she's clambering onto this particular topic because she knows young people in particular are
mhm,
are, are angry about it. She wants to be seen to be with them on this. So I mean, let's be a little bit cynical about it, but absolutely, I mean, it's not going to make the slightest difference. I mean, Western policy in the Middle East is a catastrophe. It is a moral catastrophe. People who in China, the Chinese people, next time, some American or British or French official turns up, or German official, or someone from the European Union turns up and starts talking about the Uyghurs, they should just bring out pictures, show them the pictures of what's going on in Gaza, and saying,
yeah,
"That's you,
mhm,
that's you."
mhm. It's interesting. I think I would be interested to see how the history book writing about this part, in the future, how the West handled this whole thing. It's shameful. I think it's shameful, but we'll see.
Oh, so it is a moral abyss. There
Yeah.
is no word strong enough to
Mhm.
use to condemn and describe it.
All right. You're into Tbilisi, right?
Tbilisi, Tbilisi, very
And
interesting city, by the way, beautiful
okay,
city, very interesting country, very, very interested in relations with China, I would say. I think that
okay.
they absolutely want to develop good relations with
Mhm.
China here.
Thank you so
Excellent.
much.
Have a good week and enjoy your time in China. And let me know when we get back. I'll be very interested for you to tell me everything you've seen and your sense of the country and the
Yeah.
mood there. So have a
Yes.
great
Yeah.
time.
We can talk some more about, my
Farewell.
general feeling. Yeah. Talk to you next time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.